They said I was safer there, safer than in my own home, the one I built brick by brick with hands that still remember the weight of every stone. That was the sentence my daughter used to end the argument, if you could call it that. Her voice had the soft authority of someone accustomed to being right, or at least to being obeyed. I remember the tilt of her head, the calm of her expression, the way she placed her hand on my wrist, like a doctor explaining a prognosis. "It's just until you're steady again, Mom," she said, and she smiled the kind of smile people practice in mirrors when they want to look kind, but in control. I had fallen a few weeks earlier, nothing serious, just a misstep on the garden path, but that little stumble had given her the justification she'd been waiting for. "You scared us," she said, "and it's not safe for you to live alone anymore." I was 73 then, old enough to know when safety was a synonym for exile, but not old enough to admit it out loud. The day she took me to the nursing home, the sky was the color of aluminum, heavy and dull, and the car smelled of new leather and some synthetic floral perfume that made me dizzy. Claire drove without speaking for most of the ride, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with the radio. I watched the highway signs flicker past, familiar names of exits leading back toward my life. Maple Street, Pine Hollow, Glen Ridge, each one a small invitation to turn around. But she kept going. When we arrived, she parked neatly, turned off the engine, and said, "You'll love it here." I think that was the moment I understood I wasn't being offered a choice. She helped me out of the car, though I didn't need help, and led me to the entrance like a real estate agent, showing a client a property she already owned. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and overboiled vegetables, but the lobby tried its best to look cheerful. There were pastel paintings of meadows and a fake fountain with plastic lilies. A woman in a pale pink uniform greeted us with exaggerated warmth, and I caught the quick professional glance she gave Claire, not me, the way one salesperson sizes up another. "This must be your mother," she said. Claire corrected her immediately. "Yes, this is Evelyn." "Not Mom, Evelyn," as if using my name could make the transaction cleaner. They gave me a clipboard of papers to sign. "Just formalities," Claire said, and I did what I had always done with my daughter. I trusted her. I signed where she pointed, my hand trembling slightly from nerves, not age. When I handed the pen back, she squeezed my fingers and said, "You'll thank me later." I didn't know until months later that one of those signatures transferred access to my accounts, and another released her from financial responsibility. That was the day my life became a contract written in invisible ink. The room they called mine was on the second floor, facing a courtyard where a single tree struggled to grow in a square of soil surrounded by concrete. There was a bed, a chair, a dresser, and a window that didn't open fully. "You'll be comfortable," Claire said, adjusting the curtains like she was staging a photograph. I tried to smile, but my throat was closing around something I couldn't swallow. Maybe disbelief, maybe grief. She kissed my cheek and promised to visit every Sunday. The nurse stood by the door, polite but impatient. When the door finally closed behind her, I sat on the bed and waited for the sound of her car to fade. That first night, I didn't cry. Crying would have meant hope, and I didn't have that yet. I folded my clothes carefully, lined up my slippers beneath the bed, and stared at the ceiling. The lights in the hallway never went off completely, and the faint hum of machines filled the air like a mechanical lullaby. Somewhere down the corridor, a television was playing an old sitcom, canned laughter rising and falling like waves. I thought about my house, the scent of my hydrangeas, the way the late afternoon sun turned the kitchen walls golden. I tried to remember the exact color of my front door, and for a moment I couldn't. That frightened me more than anything. Morning came early, Breakfast was served at 7 sharp, oatmeal and coffee so weak it tasted like a rumor. The dining room buzzed with the quiet drone of resignation, spoons clinking, the squeak of walkers, polite chatter about weather and medication. Some of the residents smiled at me with a kind of knowing pity. Others didn't look up at all. The staff called everyone sweetheart or darling, as if names were too heavy to carry. When the activities coordinator came by, she handed me a calendar covered in cheerful clip art. Bingo night, movie afternoon, chair yoga. "We keep everyone busy here," she said brightly. I nodded, though I'd never thought of living as something that required constant distraction. Days blurred into each other. My daughter's Sunday visits quickly became every other Sunday, then once a month. She always arrived dressed for somewhere else, heels, phone in hand, mind already divided. "How's my favorite lady?" she'd ask, dropping a bouquet of supermarket flowers on the nightstand. I'd ask about her job, her husband, her children. She'd sigh, say busy as ever, and glance at the clock. I learned to fill her silences for her. When she left, she always hugged me too quickly, like she was allergic to touch. After a year, she stopped visiting altogether. There was always an excuse, a new project, a sick child, a trip. I received postcards sometimes, glossy rectangles from places she never invited me to see. Paris, Boston, Key West. Each one signed with her name only. Never love Claire, just Claire. I kept them in a box under my bed, not because they meant something, but because throwing them away would have felt like an acknowledgement of the truth. Time does strange things in places like that. It thickens, grows heavy, sticks to the skin. I watch people arrive and vanish, their rooms emptied overnight, new names appearing on doors like a rotation of ghosts. I learned the rhythms of the building, the squeak of the laundry cart at noon, the evening news at 6, the nurse who hummed old country songs when she thought no one was listening. I learned to make myself small, agreeable, invisible. That's the real art of survival in captivity, not to fight, but to wait. I never stopped thinking about my savings. I knew they were gone, but I didn't know how or when exactly. Sometimes I would lie awake and replay the day I signed those papers, the way Claire's hand had hovered over mine. I'd remember the look she gave the nurse, relieved, triumphant. I wanted to believe she did it out of fear, not greed. I wanted to believe she just didn't know how to love someone she couldn't control. 10 years passed like that. 10 years of birthdays celebrated with sheet cake and paper hats, of doctors who spoke to me as though I weren't in the room, of pretending not to notice the world shrinking around me. My hair turned white, my body slower, but inside, I was still the woman who once built a house, tended a garden, ran her own business, raised a daughter who could stand on her own. I just didn't know that she would stand on me to do it. And then one afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. The administrator and a new young accountant were discussing something about restructuring and ownership transfers. They didn't notice me sitting by the window. My name was mentioned, Evelyn Markham, co-owner on an old deed. I felt a spark of clarity so sharp it almost hurt. I went back to my room, opened the small metal box where I kept the remnants of my life. A few letters, a photograph, a keychain from the house that was no longer mine. I turned the keychain over in my palm and thought, maybe it still is. That night, I couldn't sleep. The lights flickered softly under the door, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I thought about how safety had been the word they used to bury me alive. Safe from stairs, safe from falls, safe from independence, from risk, from myself. They said it with love, but love without respect is just another kind of cage. I lay there and whispered the sentence I hadn't dared to speak for a decade. This is still my life. The words didn't echo. They settled in the dark like a seed waiting for spring. By morning, the courtyard tree had blossomed, white petals trembling in the wind. I stood by the window, watching the light touch each branch. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped inside the building. I felt like the walls were holding their breath, waiting, and so was I. It happened quietly, as betrayals often do, not with a shout or a slammed door, but with the dry rustle of paper and the sound of someone saying, "It's just procedure." I had received a notice from the administrative office. A standard envelope slipped under my door one morning. It informed me that my care account was due for review and that a family representative would need to sign the updated financial agreement. The letter was written in that polite, bureaucratic language that seems designed to soothe you into compliance. It mentioned asset verification, updated billing structure, and revised custodial authorizations. I read it twice and still didn't understand what it meant. What I did understand was the line that said, balance depletion, projected within 3 months. I didn't think much of it at first, because I had always assumed my savings, those modest but hard-earned funds from 40 years of work, were being used carefully. My daughter had told me as much, that she was overseeing everything. The problem was I had taken her word as gospel. A few days later, the facility manager asked me to come downstairs. Her name was Mrs. Hanley, a woman whose smile had the fixed brightness of a hotel clerk. "It's just a small formality," she said. "Nothing to worry about." She handed me a thin folder and gestured toward the dotted line. I asked what it was for, and she gave the kind of vague, chirpy answer people use when they don't want to be responsible for what happens next. "We're just updating the residency agreement, Mrs. Markham. It's routine." I hesitated, and she added, "Your daughter already approved it." That sentence did what it was meant to do. It dissolved my resistance. If Claire had approved it, surely it was fine. I signed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the way she'd said routine stuck in my head, the same way Claire used to say, "Trust me," when she was a teenager sneaking out of the house. I went to the small office the next morning and asked to see my account summary. The clerk hesitated, rifled through some papers, and then said, "You'll need to contact your financial custodian for that information." I asked who that was, and she replied, "Your daughter, of course." I left the office with the odd sensation of having been erased. My own name, my own history, now ran through someone else's hands. 2 weeks later, Claire finally visited. She breezed in wearing a cream-colored coat and a scent that reminded me of money. "Mom, why do you look so worried?" she asked as she placed her purse on the chair. I handed her the envelope from the facility. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that signals impatience disguised as care. "Oh, that. Just some paperwork. You don't need to stress. Everything's fine." I pressed further. "They said my balance is nearly depleted." She laughed softly, like I had told a charming joke. "That's just how they phrase things, Mom. Don't get dramatic." I wanted to believe her, but something in her tone, too smooth, too rehearsed, made my stomach tighten. "Claire," I said quietly, "did you sell the house?" The pause that followed was so sharp it cut the air. She looked at me, then away, and said, "It was too much to maintain. You weren't living there, and we needed to cover your care. It made sense." I asked if she had at least kept the deed in my name. "It's complicated," she said, which meant no. In that instant, the floor beneath my carefully constructed trust gave way. My house, the one where I'd spent 40 years, where I'd buried my husband's ashes under the lilac tree, where my daughter had taken her first steps, was gone. Sold, liquidated, turned into an entry in a spreadsheet. I stared at her, waiting for some flicker of shame, but there was none. She talked about responsibility, long-term planning, making sure you're provided for. The words sounded professional, not maternal. I realized she was speaking the language of a person who had stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as a financial liability. After she left, I sat by the window for a long time. Outside, a group of residents were feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. The birds swarmed and fluttered in wild hunger, fighting over every crumb, and I thought, that's what we become when we lose ownership of our lives, just a flock of wings waiting for someone else to drop something from above. That night, I went to the staff office again, this time pretending I'd misplaced a receipt. While the nurse searched through a cabinet, I glanced at the corner of her desk where a pile of financial reports lay half hidden under a stack of forms. My name appeared on one of them. I couldn't read the details, but I saw enough. All assets transferred. Custodial rights terminated. My heart beat so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I thanked her politely and returned to my room. For days, I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with Claire. Every moment that now, in hindsight, was a warning disguised as concern. The way she'd insisted on handling my taxes after my husband died. The way she'd said, "You don't need to keep track of all those old accounts, Mom. It's too confusing." The way she'd urged me to enjoy life and let her manage the details. I had mistaken control for kindness, and I had signed my independence away, one signature at a time. I tried calling her the following week, but she didn't answer. I left a message, then another. The third time, her voicemail box was full. It was the silence, more than the theft, that broke me. When someone steals your money, you can rebuild. When they steal your voice, you start to disappear. One afternoon, I received a letter from her lawyer, written in that same language of distance and civility. It stated that, due to comprehensive asset allocation for sustained care, I was no longer responsible for any financial obligations, and that the family had assumed full oversight of my well-being. It was meant to sound benevolent, but what it really said was, "You own nothing. You decide nothing. You are nothing but a name on a chart." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my dresser drawer beside my wedding ring. Both were symbols of trust broken by time. The next morning, the head nurse came to check my vitals. She was kind, but her words had that same patronizing tilt. "Your daughter's taking wonderful care of you," she said, not knowing the irony. I wanted to correct her, to say that care without respect is just captivity dressed up in white uniforms and polite smiles, but I said nothing. I let her adjust the blood pressure cuff, nodded when she told me to relax, and waited until she left before letting the tears come. They weren't loud tears. They were slow, deliberate, the kind that burn more than they cleanse. A week later, I saw Claire on television. She was being interviewed for a local business feature about successful financial consultants. She looked radiant, confident, powerful, surrounded by the symbols of the life she'd built on the foundation of my sacrifice. I watched her talk about legacy planning and ethical investments. I almost laughed at the last phrase. There she was, my daughter, the woman who had stripped me of everything I owned, explaining to the world how to manage moral responsibility and finance. The audience clapped. I switched off the TV and sat in the dark, the flicker of the screen still ghosting against my eyes. For months after that, I functioned like a shadow. I attended the daily activities, smiled when spoken to, laughed at the right moments, But inside, something had calcified. I was no longer waiting for Claire's calls or visits. I stopped counting the days. I stopped believing that safety was a gift. And yet beneath the numbness, something else began to stir, a quiet, persistent sense of defiance. It wasn't rage. Rage is too loud, too consuming. What I felt was older, slower, more enduring. The certainty that what had been taken from me could, in some form, be reclaimed. One night, while the others slept, I opened my dresser drawer and took out the letter again. I read it until the words blurred. Then I took a pen from my bedside table and underlined the phrase, comprehensive asset allocation. The ink bled slightly into the paper, and I smiled for the first time in months. The next morning, I went to the small library downstairs. It was mostly romance novels and old magazines, but in the corner, forgotten on a bottom shelf, was a dusty volume titled Elder Law and Property Rights. I took it to my room and began to read. It was there, between its yellowed pages, that I learned the first truth that would save me. Ownership never truly disappears. It only hides in the details. And if you're patient enough, if you keep your eyes open and your heart steady, those details will one day find their way back to you. For a long time after the realization of what my daughter had done settled into the slow marrow of my days, life became a kind of performance. I smiled when I was expected to, followed the routines of the home with clockwork obedience, and never let anyone suspect that I was quietly collecting myself in the shadows of their predictability. There was power in being overlooked. The nurses thought I was docile. The administrators called me such a sweet, cooperative resident. They didn't realize I was memorizing the sound of the office printer, the times the courier arrived, the schedule of document deliveries. While the others watched television or napped after lunch, I would sit by the window with a book I wasn't reading, tracking the movements of staff like a patient detective. It became my own private rebellion, small, invisible acts of attention. The home's rules had made us passive, but I decided to use that passivity as camouflage. If they thought I was harmless, they would never guard against me. It was in those long, silent afternoons that I began to write again. Not letters, not diaries exactly, more like evidence. I kept a notebook hidden in the lining of my pillowcase, pages filled with observations about the daily transactions I overheard, the shifts in staffing, the names of delivery companies, the changes in suppliers. It might sound obsessive, but when you've been robbed of agency, knowledge becomes your only form of ownership. The simple act of writing restored a pulse to my thoughts. The first line I wrote was, "The opposite of forgotten is documented." That became my mantra. The quiet worsening of my situation was not in the loss of things. I had already lost everything material, but in the slow erosion of identity that followed. Once a person's finances are controlled by someone else, every decision becomes a courtesy extended by strangers. When I wanted new slippers, I had to fill out a requisition form that Claire's office approved. When I asked about taking a short trip to the botanical garden, they reminded me that mobility arrangements must be authorized by your next of kin. I had become an entry on my daughter's to-do list. Even the nurses began referring to me indirectly. Her daughter prefers she stays indoors, or her daughter said no sweets. The way they said, her daughter, as if I were a pet with an owner, made something inside me twist. I never corrected them. Not yet. The other residents accepted their situations differently. Some were lost in confusion. Others resigned to the slow choreography of managed care. A few still fought back in small ways. A woman named Ruth who refused to take her evening pills. An ex-teacher who hid her walker to force the staff to negotiate with her. They called them difficult. I admired them. I didn't join their defiance. I studied it. Rebellion without structure leads to punishment. I needed to last long enough to find a way out. The seasons changed, marked only by the color of artificial flowers in the lobby. I watched winter bleed into spring through the same narrow window, the courtyard tree shedding one identity for another. 10 years earlier, I might have called that poetic. Now it felt like mockery. Yet even as I observed my own invisibility, I began to recognize how the home functioned, how money moved, how control was disguised as kindness. There was a hierarchy among the staff, the nurses at the bottom, the administrators above them, the financial officers at the top. Once a month, a man in a gray suit came in with a briefcase and spent an hour in the manager's office. After he left, there was always tension in the air, whispers about funding reviews and compliance deadlines. I made a point of being nearby on those days, sitting in the lounge pretending to read. I didn't catch much at first, but fragments started to form a picture. The home was part of a chain, a network of facilities owned by a holding company. Profits mattered more than care. Every bed, every resident was a number on a ledger. Knowing this didn't make me free, but it made me awake. An awakening, even in captivity, changes everything. I began to speak less and listen more. The staff mistook my silence for frailty. They didn't notice that I was mapping the system that confined me. Every hierarchy has cracks. You just have to learn where they echo. One afternoon, while the administrator was out sick, a temporary office assistant handled the paperwork. She was young and nervous, her desk cluttered with folders she didn't understand. I watched as she dropped a stack, scattering pages across the hallway. I bent to help her, and when I gathered the papers, I saw one with my own name in the corner. Transfer of custodial account, deceased client notification. My heart stopped for a second. Deceased. It wasn't a mistake. I could see that the document listed several residents, each marked with a code indicating status: active, moved, deceased. Next to my name, someone had penciled in status review. I handed the papers back calmly, but inside I was trembling. I understood then that as soon as the money tied to my name ran dry, I would cease to exist in more ways than one. The system had already begun preparing for my administrative death. That night, I sat by the window until dawn. The fear that had once paralyzed me was replaced by something cleaner, colder. I realized I didn't need to escape the building. I needed to outlive the paperwork. Survival would not be physical. It would be procedural. If they had turned me into a file, I would learn to rewrite it. Over the following weeks, I tested the limits of what I could learn. I befriended the janitor, a quiet man named Henry, who worked the night shift. He liked to talk while mopping the floors, mostly about the inefficiencies of management. "They keep losing track of maintenance invoices," he said once, shaking his head. "Same paperwork gets filed twice, under different names. Real mess upstairs." I asked innocently, "Do they handle all the billing here?" He chuckled. "Nah, most of it goes through some central office in the city. Rosemont Holdings, I think. They own this whole chain." I repeated the name in my head until it stuck. Rosemont Holdings. The next day, I wrote it in my hidden notebook. It was my first real clue. Around that time, a new resident moved into the room across from mine, a retired accountant named Lewis. He had the forgetfulness that comes and goes like a faulty light bulb, but when he was clear, his mind was sharp. Over lunch one day, he mentioned he used to audit small nursing facilities. I leaned in, pretending casual curiosity. "How do they make money from us?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "They don't, not directly. They make money from the buildings, not the people. The company buys the property. then rents it back to its own management branch at inflated rates, paper profits. That night, I couldn't sleep. Buildings, not people. That was the key. My daughter hadn't just sold my house. She had sold the ground beneath it to a system that treated property as currency and lives as collateral. The more I learned, the more the world began to tilt back towards sense. Every cruel act had a logic behind it, and logic can be undone. I began writing letters not to Claire, she wouldn't read them, but to myself. Each one began with the phrase, "Dear Evelyn, you are not finished." They weren't plans yet, but sketches of what endurance might look like. I would list the things I still owned that no signature could steal: memory, observation, language, the rhythm of my own pulse. When you've been stripped of everything else, those become your assets. Months turned into years again, and the staff changed faces so often that only I remembered who had come and gone. It's strange how time works when you're forgotten. It stretches, folds, repeats. But through that monotony, I gathered fragments: a photocopy left on a desk, a conversation overheard in the cafeteria, a name whispered by a nurse who didn't know I was listening. Rosemont's finances were in trouble. They had overextended themselves, opening too many facilities, borrowing against inflated valuations. I didn't yet know what that meant for me, but instinct told me the walls that held me were starting to crack. One rainy afternoon, the television in the lounge flickered to a local news segment. It mentioned a pending investigation into elder care mismanagement by Rosemont Holdings. The anchor said words like fraudulent accounting, asset seizures, legal action. The residents barely paid attention. I sat very still. My world, which had been shrinking for a decade, suddenly widened again. Somewhere out there, the empire that had swallowed my home was collapsing under its own greed. And for the first time since signing those cursed papers, I felt the faint tremor of possibility. I didn't celebrate or tell anyone. I knew how fragile fortune could be. Instead, I continued my routines, ate my bland meals, nodded politely, pretended to nap. But beneath that surface calm, I was waiting for the next crack. I had no illusion of heroism. I was simply patient. Life had taught me that what's stolen in silence can sometimes be reclaimed in silence too. Then, one morning, a notice appeared on the bulletin board by the elevator. It was a corporate memo addressed to all residents. Effective immediately, Rosemont Holdings will be undergoing financial restructuring. Facility operations will continue without interruption. Those last words, without interruption, were meant to reassure, but I could almost hear the panic humming beneath them. I tore off one of the small detachable tabs that listed a phone number for inquiries and hid it in my sleeve. That night, when everyone was asleep, I dialed it from the payphone in the hallway. The line went to a recorded message. "Thank you for calling Rosemont Holdings. For information regarding property transfers or liens, please contact our legal office." There was an address in the city. I wrote it down on the back of a tissue. I didn't know then exactly what I would do with that information, only that something inside me had shifted again. 10 years of obedience had taught me to listen for the sound of doors unlocking, even faintly. This was that sound. The next day, I went to the administrator's office under the pretext of needing to update my emergency contact. While she looked for the form, I glanced at a document pinned to her bulletin board, a list of property owners for regulatory compliance. At the bottom, in small print, I saw it. Property title held under Rosemont Holdings, previously deeded to Evelyn M. Markham and Family Trust. My breath caught. There it was, my name, still clinging like a ghost to the edge of legality. When I returned to my room, I lay on my bed with the lights off and the notebook open. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness. I understood now that I hadn't been erased completely. Somewhere, buried in the bureaucracy of the empire that had devoured my life, a fragment of me still existed on paper. Ownership, identity, worth. Somewhere it was still written down, and that meant it could be found. Outside, the courtyard tree bent in the wind, its branches scratching against the window like a quiet insistence. I whispered to it, half smiling, "We're not done yet, are we?" For the first time in years, the silence of the room didn't feel like confinement. It felt like strategy. The shift began without fanfare, the way seasons change in places where people stop paying attention. It was late summer, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and wilted flowers from the reception desk. The television in the lounge was tuned to a cooking show no one watched, and the nurse on duty was reading something on her phone, oblivious to the world. That afternoon, a new figure appeared in the corridor, a woman in her early 30s, dressed not in the pastel uniforms of the nurses, but in a simple gray suit, carrying a clipboard and a laptop. Her name, according to the badge clipped to her blazer, was Maya Stevenson, financial officer. She was polite, soft-spoken, and, unlike most who came through those halls, she looked people in the eye when she spoke. I noticed that immediately. When she introduced herself to the residents, she shook hands instead of waving. Her palm was warm, dry, confident. It was a small gesture, but after years of being treated like fragile glass, that touch felt almost radical. Over the following days, I saw her moving between offices, opening dusty filing cabinets, whispering to the administrator, occasionally frowning at the computer screen. One morning, she sat at a corner table in the cafeteria, surrounded by stacks of documents. Curiosity was my last surviving habit, so I walked over with the pretense of asking for a napkin. I looked at the papers spread out before her, property records, ledgers, signatures. When she noticed me lingering, she smiled. "You're Evelyn Markham, right?" My name in her mouth startled me. "Yes," I said slowly. She gestured to a file in front of her. "I think I've been reading about you all morning." I must have looked confused because she lowered her voice. "I'm auditing the property chain of ownership for this facility. It's complicated. Your name appears on one of the historic deeds." The world went quiet for a moment. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, this time with a trace of curiosity, like she wasn't sure if I already knew. "You used to own part of the land this place was built on, correct?" I nodded faintly. She smiled, professional but intrigued. "Then you might be interested to know that your share was never formally dissolved. Someone transferred the operational license years ago, but the land title has a technical error. No final release of claim was filed. It happens sometimes with older deeds." She said it casually, unaware that every word was rearranging the architecture of my captivity. I thanked her and walked back to my seat in the cafeteria, carrying the sentence with me like a hidden ember. Your share was never formally dissolved. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept turning those words over in my mind until they became a rhythm, a heartbeat of possibility. The next morning, I waited for Maya in the hallway outside her temporary office. When she arrived, she seemed surprised to see me. "I'm sorry," I said. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what does that mean about the deed?" She hesitated, studying my face as if measuring how much truth I could handle. "It means, technically, you still have a registered interest in the property, but don't get excited. It's probably worthless on paper. There are corporate layers, liens, legal fees." Her voice trailed off, and I could tell she believed she was protecting me from disappointment. But what she didn't understand was that she had just opened the first door I'd seen in a decade. Over the following weeks, I became her unofficial shadow. I'd bring her coffee, ask polite questions, watch her work. She didn't seem to mind. Maybe she thought I was just a lonely old woman craving conversation. But I was studying her, how she navigated the bureaucracy, what documents she prioritized, the way she organized her files by color-coded tabs. She was efficient, but not ruthless, intelligent without the arrogance that usually came with it. When she talked about the company's problems, she didn't hide her frustration. "Rosemont's collapsing under its own paperwork," she said once. "It's like a house built out of receipts. Everything looks fine until you touch it." I remember thinking how fitting that was. My daughter's life had been built exactly the same way. One afternoon, she asked if I remembered any details about the original purchase of my house, the year, the bank, the notary. My memory, still sharp in the places that mattered, supplied everything she needed. She typed as I spoke, nodding occasionally. Then she looked up and said something that made my throat tighten. "It's strange, Evelyn. Your name wasn't just on the deed. It's on the incorporation record of the first holding company Rosemont ever acquired. That makes you part of the chain of title." She smiled faintly, perhaps impressed by the oddness of it all, but I could barely breathe. For years I had been treated like property. Now I learned I might still own the ground beneath my own confinement. The irony was almost beautiful. That night, I retrieved my hidden notebook and added a new page. On the top, I wrote, "The walls belong to me." I wasn't sure yet how literal that was, but I liked the sound of it. I started documenting everything Maya told me: dates, company names, addresses. I knew I couldn't rely on luck forever. Bureaucracy is a beast that devours the unprepared. I needed to be ready when opportunity finally cracked its jaw. Days began to take on a different texture. The routines that once felt suffocating now became cover. I still attended bingo, still folded napkins at the lunch tables, still nodded through health checks. But underneath all that obedience, I was planning. I started requesting copies of my medical and financial records, pretending I wanted them for personal closure. The staff complied, assuming it was part of some sentimental ritual. They didn't realize those papers would form the scaffolding of my escape. Maya began stopping by my room occasionally, sometimes just to talk. She was lonely too, I think, a young woman trapped in a corporate labyrinth she didn't believe in. She told me about the mismanagement she'd uncovered, the inflated invoices, the double billing. "It's not just sloppy," she said. "It's systemic. They're robbing residents while pretending to save them." I watched her as she spoke, the anger in her voice edged with disappointment. She was still young enough to believe corruption was an aberration, not the foundation. I wanted to tell her that the world runs on the quiet exploitation of the trusting, that what happened to me was only a smaller version of what happens everywhere. But I let her keep her innocence a little longer. Then one morning, she knocked on my door, her face pale. "You didn't hear this from me," she whispered. "But the company's in receivership. They're selling off assets to cover debts. This facility's up for auction." The words should have frightened me, but they didn't. They sounded like a verdict finally being overturned. I asked if she knew who would buy it. "Probably one of the banks," she said, "unless someone with a prior claim steps forward." She didn't look at me when she said it, but I knew she meant to. I closed the door after she left and sat on the bed, my pulse steady but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Prior claim. That phrase carried the weight of resurrection. I spent the next several days in quiet motion. I wrote to an old acquaintance from my working years, a lawyer named Harris, who had once handled a property dispute for me and my late husband. I told him I needed advice, that there might still be a title in my name, and that I wanted to know if it could be reclaimed. I didn't tell him the rest. He responded faster than I expected, asking for details. I gave him what I had: names, dates, copies of records that Maya had discreetly printed for me. 2 weeks later, he called. His voice was cautious but intrigued. "Evelyn, you weren't wrong. The ownership trail's a mess, but your name's there. You technically hold a dormant equity share. Small, but real." I closed my eyes as he spoke. I had waited 10 years for a sentence like that. He offered to represent me pro bono, said he owed my husband a debt of gratitude. He explained that if the holding company went under, dormant stakeholders could petition for acquisition under certain circumstances. "You might not get much," he said, "but you'll have standing." I thanked him, pretending to be calm, though my hands were trembling around the receiver. Standing. That word meant everything. After years of being told to sit down, to wait quietly, to comply, I could stand again, even if only on paper. In the weeks that followed, the energy around the home shifted. Staff whispered about layoffs. The administrator disappeared one Friday and never returned. Maya stayed, though her role became murkier. She confided in me that she planned to leave once the sale was finalized. I asked her what would happen to the residents. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "New management, same routines. They won't even notice." But I noticed everything. I began to see the building not as a cage, but as a structure made of opportunities. A place whose every flaw, every unfiled form, every missing signature could now serve me. When the official notice of foreclosure arrived, it was posted discreetly on the staff bulletin board. Most residents ignored it. I walked past it once, twice, 3 times, memorizing every word. Public auction to occur on September 17th at County Hall. The date shone in my mind like a beacon. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the courtyard tree. The air smelled of rain and laundry detergent. I whispered to the reflection in the glass, "You're going home." Home, of course, no longer meant the place I'd left. It meant reclaiming my place in the world as someone who could choose. I didn't tell anyone what I planned. Not Maya, not Harris, not the nurses who brought me tea. I simply waited, as I had learned to do, with the quiet endurance of someone who knows the power of patience. The day of the auction, I wasn't there in person. Harris went on my behalf. But when he called that evening, his voice was unsteady with disbelief. "You're not going to believe this, Evelyn," he said. "The bank undervalued the property. Your dormant claim gave you priority to match the bid. It's yours. You own it." I set the phone down slowly, feeling the weight of the years pressing and then lifting from my chest. I had no words, only the quiet recognition that something irreversible had happened. For the first time since my daughter drove me through those gates, I was no one's responsibility. I was, once again, the owner of my own existence. And as the light faded from the window, I began to laugh. Not the brittle laugh of disbelief, but the deep, shaking laughter of someone who has finally found the thread that leads out of the labyrinth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath my door with the quiet finality of something that had traveled too far to be ignored. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting unmistakable, even after all those years. My daughter's hand had changed slightly, tighter, more angular, but the loops of the L's still leaned to the left the way they always had when she was nervous. I held it for a long moment before opening it, aware that I was touching the residue of a life that had once belonged to me. Inside, the paper was heavy, expensive, the kind you order from a catalog to make an apology look like an event. The words were brief, a strange mixture of sentiment and desperation. "Mom, I've been going through a difficult time. I need to see you. Please don't say no. I'm sorry for the past." I just need to talk. There was a date and a time scrawled beneath the message the following afternoon. No return address, just her name, like a brand that once guaranteed affection and now carried the quiet menace of unfinished business. I sat on the edge of my bed, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. After everything, I had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but I had not imagined it arriving so quietly. I looked out at the courtyard tree, now bare from autumn winds, and wondered what kind of woman I had raised, what kind of daughter could take her mother's life and then return only when her own began to collapse. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on my dresser, beside the photograph of her as a child in pigtails, smiling into the sunlight. For a moment, I let myself remember the sound of her laugh, the weight of her small body in my arms, the way she used to look for me in every room, certain that as long as she could find me, the world would remain whole. It is the cruelest trick of memory that love never disappears in proportion to betrayal. When she arrived the next day, I recognized the scent before I saw her, some faint trace of jasmine and exhaustion. She stood in the doorway of my room, thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her clothes expensive but slightly worn, the collar of her blouse frayed. She looked like a woman who had been fighting gravity and was beginning to lose. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, an awkward, fragile thing, and said, "You look well." I could have laughed at that, but I didn't. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit," I said, and she did, folding herself neatly like someone afraid to take up too much space. She started with small talk, asking about the home, the food, the nurses. Her voice was too bright, the way people speak when rehearsing normalcy. Then, without transition, she began to cry. Not the dramatic kind of crying that demands comfort, but the silent kind that seeps from the corners of the eyes when words refuse to carry the weight. "I lost everything," she said finally. "The business, the house, the accounts, it's all gone." I watched her carefully, studying the face that had once been the center of my world. She looked younger in her despair, almost like the girl I had carried on my hip, except now she was holding herself. "I made mistakes," she continued, her voice breaking. "I was trying to keep things together. After Dad died, I felt so responsible for you, for everyone. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought if I managed everything, it would keep us safe. I didn't mean to hurt you." She paused, waiting for me to say something, but I stayed silent. I had waited 10 years to hear her version of events, and now that it came, it sounded like a story told to someone else. I could feel the distance between her words and my reality, the way guilt can wrap itself in justification until it becomes unrecognizable. She wiped her eyes and reached across the table for my hand. "Mom, I'm bankrupt. The house was foreclosed. I don't even have a place to stay. I came here because—" Her voice faltered, and I saw the flicker of pride struggling to survive its own collapse. "Because I thought maybe I could stay here just for a while until I figure things out." The words hung between us like smoke, impossible to disperse. She wanted to come back to the place she had once confined me to, not because it was home, but because it was the only roof left that would not judge her. For a long moment, I didn't move. I could feel the slow, deliberate rhythm of my heartbeat in my throat. Then I stood and walked to the window. The reflection showed her behind me, small and lost in the sterile light of the room. I thought of all the nights I had spent staring at that same reflection, wondering if she ever thought of me. "You left me here," I said softly. "You said it was for my safety. You sold my house, my memories, my name. You told yourself it was love. I turned and looked at her. And now you want to stay? She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. Don't explain. You've lived long enough in explanations. Just tell me the truth. Why are you really here? Her silence was answer enough. She wasn't here for me. She was here because there was nowhere else left to go. The irony was almost biblical. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. I'm scared, Mom. The simplicity of the confession disarmed me. For a brief second, I saw the child again, not the woman who had destroyed me, but the frightened girl standing at the edge of the bed during a thunderstorm. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but the faint loosening of the knot I had carried for a decade. I told her she could stay for the night. The home had guest rooms for family visits. I still technically had influence over small decisions. She thanked me, her voice trembling with relief, and for the first time since she entered the room, she smiled with genuine warmth. I knew you'd understand, she said. That night, after she went to bed, I sat awake by the window. The moonlight turned the courtyard silver, and I could see the outline of the tree swaying against the dark. I thought about the years she had taken from me, the humiliations I had endured, the slow decay of self that comes from being managed instead of loved. And yet, as I watched her sleeping form through the half-open door, I also thought about the countless small moments that had built our lives together. Her laughter, the way she used to braid her doll's hair, the smell of cookies we baked every Sunday. Time doesn't erase love. It mutates it, distills it into something sharper, less forgiving, but still recognizably alive. I realized then that I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth, and I wanted peace. The following morning, Maya came to my room early. She had an envelope in her hand and a strange look on her face. It's official, she said. The sale went through. The property's yours. You're now the legal owner of the facility. For a second, I couldn't process it. The words felt too large to fit in the air between us. Mine. After all this time, the walls that had contained me now belonged to me. Maya smiled, though her eyes glistened. I've never seen something like this before. It's like the universe just corrected itself. When Claire woke and came into my room, I was sitting at my desk, the deed spread before me like a resurrection. She looked at it, then at me, confusion clouding her features. What's that? She asked. I met her eyes. This, I said, is my home now. She blinked, not understanding. You mean? Yes, I interrupted gently. I own it. All of it. The building, the land, everything. I bought it back. Her mouth fell open. How? You don't have that kind of money. There was disbelief, almost anger in her tone. I smiled faintly. You didn't take all of it. You never looked closely enough at the pension fund your father left. You were too busy spending the parts you understood. She sank into the chair, staring at the document as if it were written in another language. So this place, it's yours? She whispered. Completely. The silence that followed was dense with reversal. I had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was real, I felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet equilibrium. She looked at me with eyes that couldn't decide whether to fear or admire me. What will you do with me? She asked finally. I didn't answer right away. I studied her face, the lines that had deepened from worry, the exhaustion etched into her mouth. She wasn't a villain. She was the inevitable result of a life lived in fear of scarcity, a woman who thought control was the same as safety. I'm not going to throw you out, I said, but you'll stay here on different terms. She frowned, not understanding. You'll work here, I said simply. There's a vacancy in housekeeping. It's honest work. You'll earn your room and your meals. Her face drained of color. You can't be serious. I folded the deed and slipped it back into the envelope. Completely serious. It's what you offered me once. Security. Now I offer you the same. She stared at me, a mixture of shock and shame flooding her features. For a moment, I thought she might scream, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if something inside her had broken, and she was relieved not to hold it together anymore. If that's what you want, she said quietly. It's not what I want, I replied. It's what's left. Over the next days, the transformation unfolded with strange calm. Papers were signed, accounts transferred, staff reoriented under new management. The nurses were kind to me in a way that felt genuine now, perhaps because I no longer needed their approval. Maya stayed for a few weeks to help with the transition. Claire began her work quietly, wearing the uniform of a cleaner. The first time I saw her pushing a mop down the corridor, my heart twisted with an ache I couldn't name. There was no satisfaction in it, only a fragile sense of balance restored. At lunch, one afternoon, I found her sitting alone in the cafeteria, staring into her cup of coffee. I joined her. She didn't look up at first. I'm not good at this, she murmured. You'll get better, I said. Work is easier than guilt. She smiled faintly. Do you hate me? I thought for a long moment before answering. No, I said finally. I don't hate you, but I can't forget either. And maybe forgetting isn't the goal. She nodded, tears glistening but unshed. I never meant to lose you, she whispered. You didn't lose me, I said. You left me. There's a difference. That night, as I walked through the hallways, the building felt transformed. The air was lighter, the silence less oppressive. I had begun small renovations, new paint, better lighting, a piano for the common room. It was no longer a place of endings. It was becoming something gentler, a space where people could live rather than wait to die. As I passed the window of the janitor's closet, I saw my daughter inside, wringing out a mop, her hair pulled back, her face calm. She didn't notice me watching. For the first time, I didn't see her as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone who was finally learning the humility that sustains real love. Later, in my room, I took out my notebook and wrote, "Justice is not revenge. Justice is returning to the center of your own life." The ink bled slightly into the page, and I smiled at the imperfection. The past had not been erased. It had been repurposed. The home that once imprisoned me was now the vessel of my freedom, and the daughter who had once reduced me to silence was now, for the first time in years, part of my world again, not as a ruler, not as a savior, but simply as a person. As I turned off the light, I thought of that first day she had brought me here, her confident voice assuring me I'd be safer. The word no longer made me flinch. Safety, I realized, was never about walls or locks or ledgers. It was about the power to decide who stays and who leaves, and the grace to choose compassion over vengeance when the moment finally comes. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the building, the sound of life continuing, of doors opening and closing, of footsteps passing without fear. For the first time in a long time, I slept deeply, knowing that the night no longer belonged to someone else's decisions, but to mine alone. The day I signed the last set of papers, the air felt different, charged with the heavy stillness that comes before a summer storm. The office, once a place where I had been made to sign away my own name, was now mine, and the irony was so sharp it almost tasted metallic. The same desk, the same typewriter indentation on the wood, the same smell of old paper and antiseptic, a shrine to years of bureaucratic humiliation, now stood under my control. I sat in the chair where the administrators once dictated the limits of my freedom, and I let the moment stretch long enough for memory to tremble, but not dominate. Across from me sat Claire, her posture rigid, her face pale and tight, waiting for the inevitable. Harris, my lawyer, was explaining the final terms of the transfer to her, his voice even but firm. She would remain as an employee with a modest wage and accommodations within the facility, all perfectly legal, all impeccably documented. He spoke of fairness. I thought of symmetry. When he finished, she signed her own contract without looking up. Her hand was steady, though her breath caught once, a small, sharp sound she tried to disguise as a cough. I watched the ink dry on the page and realized that this was the precise inverse of the moment she had once made me sign the documents that stripped me of everything. There was no triumph in it, only completion, as if a circle long unbroken had finally closed upon itself. When Harris left, the silence between us thickened. She stared at the floor, and I studied the fine lines on her face, the traces of fatigue that money and denial could no longer conceal. "It's done," I said softly. She nodded, still not looking at me. "You'll receive your first paycheck on Friday," I added. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the right form for it. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Those words, so small and formal, seemed to dissolve the last remnant of power that had hung between us. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like her mother or her victim. I felt like myself. I gestured to the window, where the rain had begun to streak down the glass. "There's work to be done," I said. She rose slowly and left the room, her reflection vanishing in the glass as she passed. I stayed there for a while longer, listening to the distant thunder and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The sound was almost soothing. Time, once my captor, had become my ally. Over the next days, the transformation of the home became something tangible, a quiet revolution of paintbrushes and open doors. I replaced the faded wallpaper with soft shades of green, brought in local musicians on weekends, and turned the neglected courtyard into a small garden. Residents who had long forgotten how to smile began to talk again. The nurses noticed it first, the shift in mood, the sense of permission to breathe. No one raised their voices anymore. Laughter became the background hum of the hallways. The building itself seemed to exhale. For so long, it had been a place of waiting, a holding pen for the discarded. Now it was beginning to live again. And yet, beneath that renewal, the deeper confrontation still waited. I knew it was coming, the inevitable reckoning between my daughter and me. I could sense it in the way she moved, efficient, precise, but with the tension of someone rehearsing a confession. She had taken to cleaning the same corridor every morning, the one that passed my office, as if proximity might offer her a chance to speak. For days, she remained silent. Then one afternoon, I found her standing by the window in the lounge, staring out at the rain. Her cleaning cart stood forgotten beside her. I approached quietly, and she turned, startled. "I was just taking a break," she said quickly, her voice brittle. I nodded. "You can stop pretending, Claire," I said. "We're long past small lies." She looked at me, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "I don't know where to begin." I walked to the window beside her, watching the ripples of rain distort the reflection of the garden outside. "The beginning is always the truth," I said. She swallowed hard. "I thought I was saving us," she said. "After Dad died, I was drowning in responsibility. The house, your health, my business, it was all slipping. I thought if I took control, if I managed everything, it would protect you. I told myself it was love, But it wasn't love. It was fear and pride. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, as though trying to hold the confession inside. I let her speak. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, tumbling into each other like water breaking through a dam. She told me about the debts, the bad investments, the desperate deals she had made to keep her business alive. She confessed that selling my house had been the first act of survival she had ever committed, and that once she'd done it, the guilt had been so immense she could only double down, convincing herself it was necessary. I couldn't face you, she said, her voice trembling. Every time I thought about calling, I felt like a thief standing outside her own home. I turned to look at her fully. That's exactly what you were, I said, not cruelly, but plainly. She nodded, tears streaming now. I know, she whispered, and I hate myself for it. For a long moment we stood in silence, the kind that contains both ruin and rebuilding. I could have reached out to her, could have offered forgiveness, or at least its polite imitation. But forgiveness is not something you hand over like a clean napkin. It's something that must earn its way into existence. You can't undo what you did, I said finally, but you can live differently now, work honestly, face what you destroyed. That's all that's left. She nodded again, her shoulders shaking. I'll try, she said. No, I replied. You'll do. That night, a storm broke over the city, the kind of storm that seems to wash memory itself. I couldn't sleep, so I walked through the corridors, listening to the rain hammering the windows. I passed the residence rooms, each door marked with the names of people who had become my quiet companions in survival. I realized that this building, once a symbol of my defeat, had become a living metaphor for repair. Each room was a reclaimed story, each life a continuation rather than an ending. And at the center of it all was me, no longer a patient, no longer a victim, but a custodian of something larger than myself. In the early hours of morning, I found myself outside Claire's door. I hesitated before knocking. She opened it almost immediately, as if she had been waiting. Her eyes were red, her hair loose, her face bare of the armor she usually wore. She looked younger, strangely fragile. I didn't think you'd come, she said softly. Neither did I replied. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us moving. Then I said, You don't owe me apologies anymore. They don't change anything. What you owe is presence, not the kind that costs money, but the kind that costs time. She nodded, and something like relief crossed her face. I told her to follow me. We went to the courtyard, stepping into the damp morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed and gleaming. The tree stood tall in the center, its branches dripping with water. When you were little, I said, you used to help me plant flowers around trees like this. You said roots were like secrets, things that held everything together. She smiled faintly through her tears. I remember. I handed her a small trowel from the gardening shed. Then let's start again, I said. Together, we planted a ring of marigolds at the base of the tree, our hands sinking into the cool earth. Neither of us spoke. The silence was enough. By the time the sun rose fully, the courtyard was alive with color. The residents gathered by the windows, watching us with quiet curiosity. Maya, who had come to say goodbye before leaving for her new job, stood at the doorway, her eyes shining. You've done something extraordinary here, she said later as we hugged. No, I replied. I just remembered who I was before the world forgot. After she left, I returned to my office where the morning light poured through the curtains in long golden lines. The deed still lay on my desk, the ink of my name glinting faintly. I placed my hand over it, feeling the weight of it, not as possession, but as testimony. This paper, this building, this life, they were all proof that dignity, once stolen, can be rebuilt piece by piece, signature by signature, breath by breath. In the afternoon, I called a meeting with the staff. I announced new policies, fair wages, transparent accounting, open doors for families, no more hidden fees, no more secret hierarchies. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then genuine. When I looked up, I saw Claire standing at the back of the room, her uniform spotless, her posture straight. She met my gaze and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of something that words could never quite hold. That evening, I walked through the halls as the sun dipped low. The light turned everything gold, even the linoleum floors that had once seemed so lifeless. I paused by the window overlooking the garden, where the marigolds burned like small suns against the dark soil. Claire was there, tending them, her sleeves rolled up, her movement steady and unhurried. I watched her for a long time. The sight didn't fill me with pride or pity, only peace, the kind that comes when life, at last, finds its rightful shape. As I turned away, I caught my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at me was older, yes, but not diminished. Her eyes were clear, her spine unbowed. I thought of the phrase I had once written in my notebook, "The opposite of forgotten is documented," and I smiled. I no longer needed to write anything down. I had become the document, the living record of survival turned sovereignty. The home was quiet now, the kind of quiet that hums with contentment rather than despair. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of laughter. It was, unmistakably, the sound of a house learning how to live again. In the months that followed, time began to move differently. The sharp edges of conflict softened into a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the house itself were breathing easier. The corridors smelled of fresh paint and lavender polish instead of disinfectant. The nurses no longer hurried. The residents no longer whispered. There was music sometimes, soft piano from the common room, played by a retired teacher whose hands had remembered more than her memory ever could. The air no longer carried the weight of endings. It had learned the cadence of continuation. People began to call this place Evelyn's home, and though the words embarrassed me a little, I let them stand. They were not a title of vanity, but of reclamation, proof that even the forgotten can name their own world again. Claire settled into her work with a quiet discipline that surprised everyone, including herself. The first weeks had been difficult for her. She moved like a woman walking barefoot on broken glass, cautious, unsure where she stood. The other staff treated her politely but distantly. Some knew what she had done. Others simply sensed that she carried a history heavier than her uniform. She never complained. She mopped the floors, folded sheets, emptied wastebaskets with the precision of someone serving a sentence she had long expected. I watched her sometimes from my office window, her hair tied back, her movement slow but deliberate, the gesture of each task almost ceremonial. There was no bitterness left in me, only a strange tenderness laced with fatigue. It is one of the odd mercies of age that anger, when held too long, erodes into compassion. Our conversations became rare but sincere. We would meet occasionally in the garden, sitting side by side on the old wooden bench near the marigolds. She would tell me about small things, the new resident who liked to sing, the repairs needed in the West Wing, the stubborn stain on the hallway carpet. Her tone was gentle, almost shy, as if she feared awakening something she had finally put to sleep. I listened, adding my own small observations, and together we built a language of coexistence, careful and true. There were no grand reconciliations, no tearful apologies, just presence. That, I realized, was all forgiveness ever really asked for, to remain present despite the wreckage. One evening, as the sun lowered over the courtyard, she came to me holding a box. "These were yours," she said. Inside were the letters I had once written to her, the ones she had never answered. Some were unopened, their edges yellowed with time. I traced my fingers over the envelopes, recognizing my own careful handwriting, the optimistic loops of a woman still waiting to be heard. "Why now?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Because I can read them now," she said. "Before they felt like accusations. Now they just feel like the truth." I didn't open them. I didn't need to. They had already done their work. I placed the box on the shelf beside the books and told her, "Keep them safe. Someday they might teach you something about love that the world forgot to teach." Seasons turned again. Winter brought frost to the windows, and I found myself waking earlier, sitting by the radiator with a blanket and a cup of tea, watching the light creep into the garden. The tree outside, the one that had stood witness to every version of my captivity and freedom, was now enormous, its branches stretching over the roof. In spring, it would cover the entire courtyard with blossoms, a white snowfall of renewal. I like to think that every root that reached deeper into the soil was a word I had once spoken in defiance, finding its way into permanence. One morning, Maya returned to visit. She had taken a position with a nonprofit dedicated to elder rights and came to tell me that part of her work had been inspired by my case. "You reminded me that justice doesn't always roar," she said with a smile. "Sometimes it just refuses to die quietly." We walked through the building together, and she marveled at the changes, the laughter, the warmth, the life. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. "You turned a place of ending into a place of return." I wanted to tell her that I had not done it alone, that the house itself had been waiting for someone to listen to its grief, but I simply nodded. That night, I dreamt of my old home, the real one, the house I had lost. But in the dream, it wasn't empty or sold. It was alive again. The windows glowed with light, and through them I saw myself, younger, baking bread, humming an old song. Claire was there too, sitting at the kitchen table, reading aloud from a letter. There was peace in that image, not because it erased what had happened, but because it no longer needed to. When I woke, I didn't ache for that house anymore. I realized I was already home. The following week, Claire knocked on my door before her shift. She stood there holding 2 mugs of coffee and an expression I hadn't seen since she was a girl, a look of pure, unguarded affection. "For you," she said. We drank in silence, the way people do when words might spoil something fragile. Then she said quietly, "I'm leaving soon. I found a job in town. Nothing special, but it's a start." I nodded, feeling both sadness and relief. "You should go," I told her. "The world still needs to see who you are when you're not trying to prove anything." She smiled faintly, tears brightening her eyes. "You'll be all right here without me?" I reached across the table and touched her hand. "I was all right even when you were gone," I said. "This time, I'll simply miss you." After she left, I walked to the courtyard. The marigolds were blooming again, fierce and gold against the soil. I knelt and touched one, its petals warm from the sun. Around me, life continued in its quiet, relentless way. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the hum of a vacuum cleaner, the low murmur of voices. The world no longer owed me anything, and I no longer owed it explanations. Everything that had been taken from me had been returned, not in the same form, but in a better one. I had not regained my youth or my old house, or the simplicity of believing that love guarantees kindness. What I had gained was rarer, the calm that comes after surviving yourself. Sometimes new residents would ask me for advice. They saw in me something between a matron and a myth, the woman who owned the home where she had once been confined. I would smile and tell them the only truth that matters. They can take your name off a deed, but not off your life. The paper is temporary, the spirit is not. And when they laughed softly, thinking I was being poetic, I would add, write everything down, even the silences, especially the silences. In the evenings, I liked to sit by the window with the lights off, letting the dusk fold itself gently around me. The rooms glowed faintly from the corridor lights. The walls now painted the color of sage and honey. Sometimes I thought about my daughter out there in the world, perhaps walking through the city, perhaps standing by another window, looking at another horizon. I didn't know if she still carried guilt, or if time had finally lifted it from her shoulders. I only hoped she had learned to live without the hunger for control that once ruled her. In my heart, there was no wish for retribution, only the quiet prayer that she would never again mistake love for ownership. As the night deepened, I would reach for the switch, but rarely turned the light on. The dark no longer frightened me. It felt like a companion, soft and knowing. I had come to understand that peace is not the absence of what hurt us. It is the decision to stop letting it speak louder than what remains. And what remained after everything was mine. The garden, the laughter, the tree, the silence, the steady pulse of a house that had learned, as I had, how to keep living after being emptied. Sometimes I think of the words I wrote long ago when I was still invisible. The opposite of forgotten is documented. I smile now, knowing how little I understood then. The opposite of forgotten is not to be written. It is to be remembered by living well. I am 83 now. I wake early, drink strong tea, and watch the light touch the courtyard tree that once stood in a square of concrete and pity. It grows wild now, taller than the building, its roots pushing deep through the earth as if reclaiming what was once taken. I like to think we share a secret understanding, that we both survived pruning and still found a way to bloom. And sometimes, when a new woman arrives, frightened and uncertain, clutching the last remnants of her dignity, I take her hand and tell her gently, "You are safer here now, not because someone will watch over you, but because you'll remember that you belong to yourself." Then I smile because it's true. I am living proof.